Roger, welcome to the Truth Contract.
Thanks, David. We've spoken about this for a little while now, which since we recently met, and it's an exciting project.
Thank you very much indeed. We have indeed met up and chatted several times over the last few weeks since we met, and this journey for us started about a year ago, where we listed out a whole bunch of stop doing bad things topics, which I shared with you. And you very kindly said, well, there's one I'd like to add to the list, which is let's stop messing with nature. So here we are today to focus in on that. Before we jump into that, though, would you give our viewers and listeners a sort of 1 minute bio on your veterinary background? Because if I look you up on the internet, it says you look after humans too.
Well, yes, I started off as a very conventional vet working in farm animal practice. Did that for about 8 years. And to cut a long story short, I sort of made the journey over the other side of the fence to the alternative side, initially trying to prove that it didn't work to myself, and then discovered it actually works better than I thought it was going to. So then I adopted various different technologies, including scalar and more recently wave genetics and things like that, to try and help the body to heal itself, because that's all that ever heals. We never heal anything as clinicians. We only help the body to heal itself. And so my sort of interest sort of spans from the farming side, where I originally worked as a vet. I've still got a big interest in the farming side. And then a lot of the technology that I use, I was actually trained to treat people with it because it hadn't been used on animals before. And then I adopted those techniques to treat the animals. So it seemed to make sense to carry on treating people as well. So I treat animals as a vet, but I treat people as a human practitioner.
And I ought to chip in that a few days ago you kindly did a treatment on my back, which so far has been miraculous.
I'm pleased to hear it. Pleased to hear it.
Two years of pain and discomfort, which has literally disappeared.
Well, yeah, it's an amazing piece of kit. And every time, you sort of hear of some feedback, it sort of just reminds me of how good it is and why I got into it in the first place.
So thank you for that introduction. So our theme today is stop playing with nature. And so my first question to you is, playing with nature a new concept?
No, a lot of people probably think it is, but we've actually been doing that for a long time. If you think about it in terms of selective breeding for dogs, they've all come from the grey wolf derivative, and yet we've bred them to do different purposes. So some have been bred for hunting because they could sniff and follow a trail well. Others for herding, to help with the farming side. Others for guarding, obviously then sort of the recreational greyhounds for racing. And we've done the same with cattle and sheep and goats. We've sort of divided them and bred them and selected traits for what we want. So we've got dairy or meat are the two main sort of divisions really for the ruminants. And then obviously for chickens, we've got meat and eggs. And if you look at a chicken that lays eggs, it looks very different from the chicken we see when we go to cook. So, we have done this selective breeding in the past, but it's been done through nature. We've had individuals and put them together and let them procreate in the normal way and see what happens. And the way of doing it that way, you get check and balance from nature. If nature says it's okay, then it sort of goes ahead, and if it doesn't, then it doesn't. So it's not an old one. We've done it the same with crops as well. We've changed how our grains are now. I think everybody knows of wheat that we see it now, and even in recent years that's come a lot shorter to the ground, so that there's less straw about. And we used to have more spelt, was more typical of the grains that we had when we first started farming, and that sort of changed. And even the vegetables, all the vegetables we see now are completely different from what was around in the wild. And a lot of them have been derived from wild mustards, such as Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, and kale. and they're very different. Wild carrots taste very bitter. Some wild variations of potato are very poisonous, because obviously they're part of the nightshade family. So we have selected for those over the different years and actually created completely new vegetables. And it's happened in sort of native breeds where we've introduced things that weren't present. So like we put rabbits or cane toads in Australia, both with disastrous consequences because they were supposed to sort out a problem that was there. And sort of it got out of control. And once the genie's out of the bottle, we can't put it back. And even the grey squirrels, they came to the UK from North America and they've pretty well wiped out our red squirrels, apart from in very small areas and the Isle of Wight. So, messing with nature isn't new. And I'd say, being successful with messing with nature has not really happened up to date yet. So I have grave reservations over whether what we're trying to do, whether it might happen in the future, is likely to be successful again.
Can I just ask a couple of clarification questions? So, if you breed a Cocker Spaniel with a poodle and you end up with a cockapoo and it works, what you're saying is that nature has allowed that to happen naturally. But if nature didn't want it to happen, you couldn't interbreed those two dogs successfully.
Yeah, obviously there's some exceptions to the rule, but even that happens within a breed. If you get a compatible male and female within the same species or breed and cross them, if there is something incompatible about their DNA, then the pregnancy won't go to term. So, there are checks and balances in nature already. And we sort of think that we can master nature and twist it to our own devices at our peril.
And then to the vegetables that you mentioned, you said that carrots used to be very bitter. I remember as a kid, my mum putting sugar in the water that she boiled carrots with.
Yeah, I think a lot of the fruit and the vegetables have been selected for sweeter variations. When I was a kid, we had wild raspberries in the garden, and they were tiny, and the amount of pulp around the seed was very small compared to the sort of more commercial raspberry plants and canes that my mum and dad grew in the garden. So, fruit has changed, and I gather, bananas used to be mostly seeds in the banana with, again, very little flesh around it, and we've sort of selected that out to the bananas we see now, which is mostly pulp and very little seed. So what we think as fruit and veg now is very different from what was in the past, and therefore what we had available to us when we evolved, which is why humans evolved primarily as carnivorous animals.
Has the human gut biome had to adapt over the centuries because of the change in the food?
Up to a point. I could argue that actually no mammal actually metabolizes plant material itself. The herbivores have an area of or the ruminants have an area of the stomach, like the rumen, where the plant fiber sort of gets fermented by the bacteria, by the microbiome, and the horse, it's the hind gut. And some of the primates have got a very long cecum, which we no longer have, and has actually become a sort of vestigial appendix, which a lot of people end up losing at various stages. So, we don't have an area of our digestive tract that is dedicated to fermenting plant material, which is really what is required to get nutrients out of plants properly. So, what is healthy for us, and the food available now is not very similar at all to what we had when we were evolving and when we developed our brains, when we were eating sort of carcasses that had been left by other carnivores. We had hands, so we could smash up the bones and get the marrow and get to the brains in the skulls. And that's primarily because we fed their brain. That's why our brain developed so much. And there's evidence to say anthropologically that when agriculture started about 10,000 years ago, there was a noticeable shrinkage of the brain as people started to become more dependent on plant material within their diet. So yeah, it's some bits of us have changed, but in terms of the microbiome, it will to a certain degree adapt to the diet. But in terms of how that has changed our ability to utilize plants for nutrition, I'd say we haven't really developed an area within the gut where really all mammals that do utilize plants much more have developed this fermentation area.
So over the centuries, our diet has changed. Our gut biome has also perhaps changed, but not as much as it might have needed to change to adapt to the new foods we were eating. But some people could argue, well, people are living longer now, so surely that shift has been a good thing.
I think it depends. Depends how you look at it. I think we live longer because modern medicine has learned how to prop people up in illness. So people are living longer but living sicker. And I think medicine has got much better at treating emergency situations and getting women and children through childbirth, which was a big sort of problem in the past. But if you go into a cemetery and you look at a lot of the gravestones, actually you sort of see a lot of obviously those that did die in childbirth or as sickly children, obviously when TB and things like that was around and sanitation wasn't so good. But then if you look at a lot of the gravestones, they're actually living quite a long time, and there's probably not many in the middles in the sort of 40s, 50s and 60s. If you got to that age, you probably lived till you were 80 or 90. So I would say that actually, and chronic disease has certainly something that I don't think was around so much then. So I think the quality of life from that point of view, you could say, has, in terms of just health, we have regressed because we see so much more chronic disease now. I mean, heart disease wasn't known probably till the 19th century or so. Diabetes was very rare. Obesity was very rare, even, up until about 50 years ago, we didn't have the same obesity epidemic that we've got now. So, I would say people are living longer up to a point because they're being propped up by better sanitation and better, and medication that is symptomatically suppressive and keeps them alive.
I've been fascinated over the last 6 months with the Maha movement in America.
Yeah.
And 68% of Americans have at least 3 chronic illnesses.
Yeah, we see the amount of fast food and processed food. There's a saying that says only humans are, arrogant enough. No, only humans are wise enough to manufacture their food and stupid enough to eat it. And I think there's another bit behind that, and arrogant enough to think that they can outdo what nature already provides. So yeah. And of course, the other nation which people assume is very healthy because it's very much plant-based is India. And yet they've got very high levels of diabetes there because so much of their diet is carbohydrate-based. So, yeah, around the world, there are sort of large pockets of very unhealthy individuals. Well, not just individuals, but populations, really. And it's the same in our animals.
As my mum used to say, we are what we eat.
Yeah, there is certainly an element of truth in that, and I think as we understand biophysics more, then people will go, you know, we are according to light. But I think, certainly what goes in is hugely impactful on our health, and to the point where we're now starting to understand why local produce produced locally is best for us because of the levels of deuterium in the produce. So that takes us down a whole nother rabbit hole of nutrition that is another story. But but there are very good sound medical sort of biophysiological reasons why locally produced food is so much more healthy for us than food that's being transported across the world
And ultra processed
and ultra processed and seed oils and carbohydrates and everything else.
So you've answered my question about, you know, is playing with nature a new concept? And you basically said, no, it's been going on for a long time. So how are we playing with nature now?
Okay, so more recently, as a sort of microbiology has got better at looking at DNA and things like that, we've started doing GM crops where it's being manipulated in the
Sorry,
laboratory.
GM, genetically modified.
Yeah, GMO, genetically modified organisms. So we're doing modifications in the laboratory, as much as or more than we're doing in the greenhouse now. And certainly in the UK, they've just lifted the ban off GM modification, with the proviso that nothing happens in the laboratory that couldn't otherwise happen if it was done through natural selective processes. But you can't, how do you prove that just because you do something in the laboratory would have been okay if you allowed nature to take its course and put those individuals together to cross breed them? Or so it's not that straightforward as it sounds. And once you start interfering with genetics, we don't know the knock-on effects. When they first discovered the genome, the human genome, they were saying only 5% of it was coding genome, and there's something like 95% of it, they called it junk DNA. And yet now we've started to realize that what was previously thought to be junk DNA actually isn't at all, and it gives context to how the genes that are structural, if you like, are being read and interpreted and used. So once we start changing with genes, then we start messing with things that we don't yet fully understand. And there's all sorts of other issues around that.
So I've got two clarification questions for you. You said that GMO crops, well, there are recently GMO crops where manipulation occurs in the lab rather than the greenhouse. Could you explain that to me?
Well, they're doing gene editing. So they're splicing or genes that they think are good and replacing genes that they think aren't so bad. So they might insert a gene that they think will give resistance of a crop to a certain insect or something, or be resistant to some sort of other plant virus or something. So on the face of it, it sounds like quite a good idea. But they just don't understand necessarily the ramifications of inserting that gene, how it might impact how the other genes around it might be expressed, and whether even there's a whole bigger scale of consideration, that this sort of reductionist idea that we look at just what we're trying to achieve in changing that one gene. We forget that it's part of the whole organism, and that if we absolutely, if we get that plant to be more resistant to a certain insect, then maybe that certain insect will have ramifications within its own environment, and birds might not be able to eat so much, or there won't be so much pollination going along because actually those
Mm.
insects take part in that pollination process. So we sort of narrowed down, as science has tended to do that, is to focus in, focus in, focus in, and in doing so, when you've got that smallest or largest magnification on, you lose sight of the whole picture that's actually it's a part of. And so there are, as usual, unintended consequences, which is what's already happened with some of the examples I've given, like the squirrels and the cane toads and the rabbits in Australia, etc.
So it sounds to me that this lifting of the ban on GM modification in the UK, um, if you like, took on board um, the 5% of DNA that they thought was helpful, but didn't realize that the 95% they thought was junk was also somehow affected by it. And that there's an arrogance in the thinking that, well, all we're doing is doing something that would have happened naturally anyway and making it happen faster. But it hasn't allowed Mother Nature to say, hang on, I don't want this to happen. It doesn't work that way.
Absolutely. I think, that's a very good summary of it, David. I think it's, and it's happening now, and they're sort of doing things with mosquitoes now as well. They're using mosquitoes as vectors to introduce. And there's one project in Hawaii where they're trying to get mosquitoes to spread a bacteria called Wolbachia, and it's done with the idea that it'll make mosquitoes infertile, that are spreading some sort of avian sort of virus, but it's not that simple, and they haven't done the risk benefit analysis in the much wider picture. And of course, those who are trying to highlight it and bring it to the fore are struggling against the might of the organizations and the money that's been invested in that project to date. And so you've got this conflict of interest where business proposals seem to be taking precedence over what we should or should not be doing, and that's sort of a worrying aspect, because once that genie is out the bottle, as I said, it can't be put back. And there's also other worrying things, as if they're using mosquitoes to spread Wolbachia as a bacteria now, who's to say? Obviously, we get bitten by mosquitoes as well. Who's to say what the implications of those mosquitoes biting people, or are they sort of laying the foundation for using mosquitoes to spread vaccines, for example, or some other some other nefarious idea? Because unfortunately, with any sort of technology, there's usually a duality to its ability. A technology that can do good can also, unfortunately, be often used to do harm as well. And when money becomes involved and there become other political agendas, unfortunately, the good doesn't always out the bad.
So one of the areas I'd like to talk to you about that I've read a bit about over the last few months is mRNA, which was used in the COVID jabs by Moderna and Pfizer.
Yeah.
I've been terrified reading all about the mRNA technology, which I think was used for the first time in the COVID jabs, now being used in cancer treatments and all sorts of other vaccination programs and interventions. But I've also heard that mRNA is going to be used in farm animals and in plants. Is that correct?
I'm not so sure about the plant side of things, but I dare say it probably could be. But certainly there is already a product in the United States called Sequivity, which is an mRNA product that's used with pigs. And it, a bit like the COVID jabs, it's gone through an authorization process. and actually was authorized in 2018 before the vaccine definition was changed. So how they managed to get it through the regulator and the FDA, I really don't know, but it's very concerning because it's a platform. It's not even a single product, because what they do with Sequivity, for argument's sake, there's an outbreak of respiratory disease on a pig farm. The vet will go along, they'll swab the pig, they'll send the swabs back to the laboratory, they'll identify what they think is the causative virus or organism. They will then genome read it and work out what the genome is, select a gene of interest and a protein of interest, and effectively make an mRNA that will get the pigs to generate that protein of interest for the immune system to respond against. But from the process of swabbing the pigs on the farm to going back to being injected in the pig is 8 to 12 weeks. So there is no time at all to check whether what is going back is safe, either in itself or the potential for the protein that it might be asking the body to generate, whether it will have other unintended consequences in the body, such as creating prions, which are infectious proteins that everybody's heard about it, I think, in terms of mad cow disease. So, we know that viruses can be prionogenic. We know viral proteins can be prionogenic. And so to get the body through pigs to start producing these proteins that they haven't checked as to whether they're prionogenic or not, then, they really don't know what's happening. And of course, if the pigs are injected with it and there is a prionogenic protein in there, because of the way pigs are slaughtered fairly young in their life, for they're grown quick, slaughtered fairly young, there wouldn't necessarily be time for those. You wouldn't see mad pig disease because they wouldn't live long enough to manifest it. But it doesn't mean that the prion wouldn't be in the meat. Mm-hmm. And of course, then if we're eating it and the prions come into us, then we have that risk that you could be seeding prion diseases like Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is the human version of it. And then for the mad cow disease, it was new variant CJD. So there might even be another variant of CJD that could be initiated by eating pork meat or pig meat from the United States or wherever else the mRNA was used. And of course, the more that happens, and if it's done in lots of different food production animals, the risk is you end up producing what's called a super prion, which isn't even species specific. So it would be prionogenic in whichever species it was in. And then, as you say, with plants, there is an element of they can come into that cycle as well, because if the prions are excreted out through the digestive tract as pig manure, if that is spread on the ground, there is evidence to show that prions in the soil can be uptaken by plant roots, and it can be distributed to the leaves. And obviously, if that was a crop where people were eating the leaves, then the prions would be getting into the people through the leaves as well. So, and that's been shown that that's one possible mode of spread that's happened already with chronic wasting disease in deer, which is a problem in the United States now.
Right, but it not only goes into the animals, but it goes into the soil, which goes into the water table, which ultimately goes into the water supply.
Precisely.
I'm a few months ago, I was at a farmer's market in the Cotswolds and was in a coffee shop queue and started chatting to the lady in front of me. And I'm not sure how we got onto the subject, but she happened to be the Cotswolds big farm animal vet pharmacist.
Right.
And she'd had that job for nearly 40 years. And she was telling me that over the winter of 24, 25, she had dispensed more stuff to deal with big animal pneumonia than in the previous 40 years added up together.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, what on earth caused that? And she pointed at the sky. And, here's another rabbit hole that we could go down on stop messing with nature. But she basically said all of these chemtrails and geoengineering is landing on the cattle and the big animals, which goes into the crops and the trees and the soil and the water table. And she wondered if that was causing the respiratory illnesses in the cattle, but they were then being treated by pharma with an mRNA type treatment, even though it was nothing connected to what the cause had been.
Well, certainly, I mean, the positive note for people in the UK is that we don't have mRNA vaccines for animals in the UK. Nothing's been authorised here yet. But I certainly agree that, whatever's sprayed in the sky can impact the cattle. I think also, farmers have been put under so much pressure to produce cheap food that they put the cows and the livestock themselves under pressure, and so they're at a higher stress level. And we're starting to realize that actually how we feed our animals impacts how healthy our animals as food are for us. And so, this is one of the reasons why I'm very supportive of regenerative farming, where we need to get back to, grassland, extensive grasslands where they don't spray lots of chemicals on grass because it doesn't need it. And the cows and the sheep and the goats are all out eating grass and they're moving around, and that keeps the soil healthy rather than, arable monoculture crops require tillage to put the crops in. They then require spraying of herbicides and pesticides, and that whole turning of the soil and damaging of the soil, glyphosate is the classic one, isn't it? It lasts in the soil 20 years and it damages the soil fauna. It's not just dirt. There are thousands of organisms and microbes and insects and worms and everything that are associated with the soil. And if we damage those, the soil health suffers, and then our food suffers. So, I think there was, and then the fertilizer that they use is all based on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK. And I think even in the 1930s in the States, there was a famous line that said, "Never has the nation been so well fed and so undernourished." Because once you deplete the soil, the goodness, the nutrients aren't there to go into the food. And so if we go back to regenerative farming, which obviously some people will see it as a retrograde step, but it isn't. It's going back to actually producing nutritious food, and then we need less of it to feed the nation. And that's one of the things that we're struggling with in the UK, and I think in lots of the countries in the West, is actually being self-sufficient in food and having that food security to know that in times of hardship we can still feed our population.
Have you ever seen the film documentary Kiss the Ground?
No, I've heard about it, but I haven't seen it. I know there's another one with, is it that the one with Woody Harrelson?
Yes, it came out 4 or 5 years ago. It's a must watch. It's really well done. And in fact, the sequel to it has come out literally in the last week, called Common Ground. And one of the things that they talk a lot about, returning to regenerative farming, and because of how the soil has been destroyed in the ways that you've just described, they're basically saying that unless we revert to regenerative agriculture, there's no more than 50 to 60 more harvests from the soil that we have allowed to be created.
Yeah.
One of the things that I learned, which fascinated me watching Kiss the Ground, was that soil itself has like a biome.
Yes.
And to the point the quote you just gave about the nation being very well fed but undernourished. One of the things that came out in that film was how, if you'd had a kilogram of spinach, say 100 years ago, you'd need, I can't remember what multiple.
About 300, you need nearly 300 times the portion of spinach that used to be to get the same amount of iron.
Right.
And even, and I remember when I was a kid, iron was very bitter.
Even though we go into the supermarket and the spinach is all washed and in a nice bag and all the rest of it, it's actually, did you say 300?
Yes. It's under that. It's 260 or 280 something.
Right. So the lovely bag of washed spinach has got 1/200th of the nutrition and the iron and what have you in it that it would have had 50, 60 years ago if you'd picked it from your garden or your allotment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the iron isn't even that bioavailable from spinach either. A lot was made of it, but it's not really that bioavailable.
I read that elsewhere. Maybe you could expand on it. But all vegetables and fruit, in particular oranges, I think, you need to freshly squeeze 8 oranges to get the same amount of goodness, nutrition, or minerals that you would have done 50 years ago out of squeezing 1 orange.
Yeah, and of course the side effect of that, especially when they're, if you take oranges for example, to get 50 times maybe it's the vitamin C level, but if say for argument's sake it is vitamin C, so if you had to have 8 oranges to get the same level of vitamin C, in order to take that vitamin C, you've also got to have 8 times the amount of sugar, and all the problems that we know are caused with that. So. And then coming back to the spinach's green vegetables are very high in a product called oxalate. And oxalate can't be metabolized. It accumulates in the body and cause all sorts of problems. So, we end up, if we're not careful, messing with nature. We know we've put on these fertilizers and we've worked out how to grow it well, but we've not paid attention, as you say, to the soil health and also then the nutrients going into our food. And then we've got to eat so much more of it that then we end up taking in so many more calories to try and satisfy our mineral requirements that we end up with massive health problems in terms of diabetes or some sort of metabolic disease, or we store up lots of oxalates that are the basis for many kidney stones. So yeah, it's so we've been messing with nature in many ways for a long time, very unsuccessfully, which, is the idea that we're suddenly going to do it well and do it right and get it right. Unfortunately, I have very little faith in that concept.
What is interesting to me is if you walk into any decent major supermarket chain's grocery section, all of the vegetables are the perfect size, the perfect shape, beautifully colored, and da 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 da. And so it's almost like a myth or a mirage. It looks super attractive.
Yeah.
However, if you actually looked at how over the last 50 years, a pound of any of that vegetables has now got 1/8 or 1/10 or 1/200th of the nourishment that it had 50 years ago. And because of all of the fertilizers and things that have gone, it's actually destroying our health.
Yeah, absolutely. And that it comes down to that, thing that I was saying, the reductionist idea where everything gets looked at in little pots, and, they look at, for argument's sake, Bovaer in cattle where you've got, methane, and they look at it just in that. Whereas actually we've got to think of, there's a much bigger picture. And when we look at our food and the nutrition and what it should be doing is supporting our health, we've got to then start not just factoring in the cost of producing the food. We need to also factor in the cost of treating the ill health that the food is causing at the same time. So, we've got to have a much more holistic overlook of our, of ourselves, as well as what we're doing in the planet. And I mean, I think the whole planet, actually, we've got to look at a whole holistic, need to have a whole holistic appreciation that everything is interlinked. I mean, in the UK, we're talking about dimming the sun, but we've got no concept that actually the old butterfly effect, where a butterfly flaps its wings in one continent and it causes a hurricane 3 continents across, so we start dimming our sun here. We've got no calculation being done as to what that's going to do to rainfall or air currents or sea currents or anything, or rain or drought or whatever around the rest of the world. We've got to start pulling back from looking at things in tiny little pots and saying we want to achieve X, and actually realize you can't do X on its own without interfering with the whole of the rest of the alphabet.
No, it is that reductionist mindset where I think humans have arrogantly thought that they can use mechanics and mechanical engineering to somehow control nature, that has a lot to answer for.
And it's gone into biology as well, it's and now that they think that they can gene edit with CRISPR and also introduce things into the body with mRNA, or even the self-amplifying ones, which are even more scary, where not only does the body produce protein without any check on how much is being produced, but the body is instructed to produce the mRNA itself. So you've got 2 levels of uncontrolled replication going on. And I think that those self-amplifying RNAs are a whole nother level of scary above the mRNAs itself. And the mRNA itself as a whole platform should be put in a dungeon and never see the light of day, quite frankly.
I've got a question later on about that, but we can talk about it now. We've had a lot of interest from members, and we've had a few great speakers about mRNA as a technology, as a platform, and how it needs to be stopped. And the most scary part for me, though, is these sheddable self-replicating mRNA interventions, which means that I have no ability to have informed consent whatsoever, which is it was a bit like geoengineering. I didn't vote for it. No one asked me if I'd like to be sprayed with it.
No, absolutely. It's interfering with your ability to produce vitamin D and all the rest of it. And certainly, and that's my other concern, obviously, with the mRNA in animals, is that if we start using it in pets, which they've already started doing in the United States, they've got a rabies mRNA product over there. They've also got a canine influenza and a cat FELV.
Sorry, what's FELV?
Feline leukemia virus.
Right, thank you.
So for cats. So, thankfully they haven't come into the UK yet, but you can bet your bottom dollar that there will be a plan to spread those vaccines, although they're not vaccines, worldwide. And as you say, if we know that there are research papers showing that the human COVID jabs were able to shed spike protein, if we're not careful, our pets would potentially be able to be shedding as well. So, apart from the harm that it's going to do to them potentially, obviously, there is a wider concern that if they start shedding as well, then those spike proteins or equivalents or whatever protein they're shedding could actually impact us as well. So it's we really need to keep on top of it and get some sort of injunction if we can against them, to be honest.
Well, we need to make sure that they're never allowed to come into the UK. And does the mRNA you talk about in pigs, the sequivity, I think you called it, presumably those pigs get exported?
I don't know how much they are. Obviously, there's a huge market for pig meat in the United States already. I don't know how much is exported, but potentially, yes. I would hope that the one thing about the States is they've tended to use hormones in meat production, livestock production over there that we've not used or allowed over here. And I'm hoping, I'm pretty sure that as a result, we don't therefore accept their produce here, because there's been quite a big push, isn't there, to force the UK to accept chlorinated chicken from the States. So on the whole, I don't think their livestock products, meat products, come to the UK. But obviously, we do have some areas of the world where we do import meat from. Obviously, New Zealand, we get lamb from there. We get beef from Argentina and bacon from Netherlands and Denmark. And we know, Denmark has already mandated Bovaer in its farms there. So I don't think we tend to bring in beef, but obviously, if we get rid of farming here by putting lots of solar farms on fertile ground and discouraging farmers from producing food, then the food has got to come in from somewhere. And if there's going to be shortages, as I think there are going to be, then, with the option is eat food that we wouldn't otherwise want to import, or eat nothing. What the government is going to do. We're going to start getting those products coming in from countries that we wouldn't necessarily want, where they're doing practices that we don't want here. So, again, more important reason why we become self-sufficient for our food here and support our farmers, so that we are then reliant on our own food, that we know where it comes from. And it's not just we know the quality of what we're doing, but we're also then making sure we're not having what we don't want.
We've absolutely got to have a strategy of food sovereignty for this country.
Yeah.
And anything which has had mRNA injected into the food chain needs to be properly labeled, as with Bovaer and other things as well. I had a silly question. Why is it that manufacturers of, in my case, dog food on the bags or the tins emphasize that it's grain free? What's the point about it being grain free?
Yeah, there's a protein, I think, in wheat which tends to glue up the villi, the little finger-like projections in the small intestine, and weaken the gap junctions between the cells that can allow things to cross the gut barrier that shouldn't otherwise cross. And so that sets up allergies. So you get quite a lot of dogs that have allergies, and a lot of them develop them on the kibbles, which are sort of primarily grain based. And the same thing happens with people with irritable bowel disease and Crohn's disease. Grains really aren't a good food at all, really, for that reason. And so that's why they emphasize grain free. But and I think there's also the carbohydrates. Obesity is one of the biggest problems we've got with pets in the UK. And this again is primarily because we're feeding them carbohydrates, which is what they're getting from the plant side of their diet. So I'm very much into feeding raw meaty bones. I've been banging that drum for the last 30 odd years. And I'm not a fan of feeding plant material at all to carnivores, because I've never seen a natural history program where dogs attacked a wheat field, dug potatoes, went into a rice field to eat, or anything else, or pre-ground their food either. They eat meaty lumps of bone carcasses, and that's what we need to be replicating, because that's the diet they evolved. That's what they were eating when they evolved. And that's also an important subtle difference. It's not what they evolved to eat, it's what they ate when they were evolving. And so they need that, that sort of raw meat and bone to keep the teeth clean and provide the nutrients they want and give them satiation from chewing and gnawing on bones and crunching things up and doing all the things that dogs love doing.
Well, my dog who you've met, her breakfast this morning was a duck neck, some chicken wings, and a chicken carcass.
Perfect.
All,
Perfect.
all that she would have eaten in nature.
Exactly. That's exactly what they need to be on, and it sorts out so many health problems, that are arising from that. And the other aspect, obviously, we've got to think about in terms of, we've spoken about genetics as well, is that there are what are called epigenetics. So there are influences that go down through the generations, but that aren't necessarily coded by the DNA. And there was a chap called Pottinger who in the 1930s did some experiments with raw feeding cats. And what he did was he fed them meat and milk and they were all very healthy. So then he started feeding them food that wasn't very good for them, like the kibbles. And he found that the damage he did in one generation of feeding the incorrect feed took 3 generations of correct feeding to reverse it and return the cats back to being as healthy as they were before. And I've also read somewhere that one exposure to aspartame can, in humanized mice, had an effect causing depression 3 generations down in the mice as well. So, what we have.
Aspartame is the
So
fake
yeah, it's the
sweetener
artificial
that they
sweetener.
use in Diet Coke and what have you.
Yeah, exactly. So, what we eat isn't necessarily just impacting our own health, it is potentially impacting future generations' health as well. So, we have a responsibility to eat the best diet that doesn't have this generational impact. But to eat the right diet, we've got to produce the right food. And so we've got to treat our animals correctly and feed them properly on grassland and all the rest of it. So, as I say, this web of bigger picture is far bigger and far further reaching than we might first think.
No, it is much. The truth contracts matrix shows how all of those different industrial complexes all interlink with each other, and but ultimately, if we want us, our children, and our children's children to be healthy and not be reliant on the biopharmaceutical industrial complex, we need to eat healthily and exercise. And if we just did those two things and we kept our mind cleaner, we wouldn't need all of those pharmaceutical interventions to keep us alive,
Yeah,
and we'd be healthy. And so, in order to have that healthy food supply, we need to go back to regenerative farming, and we need to stop poisoning the soil from the sky and in fertilizers and pesticides, and have an organic diet.
absolutely. It is, as you say, it is all linked in. It all goes back to all those basic things. So, it's hugely important to get it right. And the consequences of getting it wrong are generations of illness, that's going to cost the economy hugely in supporting the people who are sick. And obviously, as a population, we're tending to get older, and so there will be fewer and fewer fitter people who are trying to support more and more unhealthy people. So, the whole, the economics comes into it as well. It isn't just about nutrition and health. It's there's a whole economic element to it as well. And of course, if we're eating healthier and we've got better nutrition and better nutrient density in our food, and we're exercising and doing the good lifestyle, then we'll be that much more productive. People will be more inventive, and other things will progress as well. So, again, the ramifications go beyond just personal health and all the rest of it.
No,
It's all societal.
it's societal health, isn't it?
Yeah,
I completely agree with you. I think that all these things are a good thing to do in and of themselves, for individuals and for society, but actually the knock-on consequences of a return to regenerative farming would, over a very short period of time, result in a much healthier population with less call on the NHS, less people off work with, illnesses and health problems, which would help the country become more productive and help the country grow, which is what everyone's trying to figure out. How do we grow the size of the pie of the UK economy, not just a bigger share for the elites?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, you've mentioned the word reductionist a couple of times. Can you think of a few examples where this reductionist ideology on the surface could look like something was a smart idea, but when you zoomed out, you realized it was a stupid idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I go back to my experience of when I was a farm vet, um, the amount cows probably average 6 to 8 thousand litres a year across a lactation, and if a herd was averaging 10,000 litres in a year, it was quite an exceptional, good quality, high genetics herd to do that sort of level of milk production. And yet 10,000 seems to be pretty much the average now, and the better herds are heading sort of towards 13,000 litres of milk. But the flip side of that is we got now dairy cows have only got an average of 3.6 lactations before they end up being replaced. So the average age of a dairy cow is now 4.5 years old. Whereas in the 1990s, when I was doing the farm work, I'd regularly see cows that were perhaps 8 to 12 years old. And so they were doing 6 to 10 lactations. So although higher milk production on a reductionist level looks like a good idea, the welfare implications for the cows has been catastrophic. And the costs go up because if they're on that much of a metabolic knife edge, then they're more likely to get infections and mastitis and lameness and all these other problems that end up having to be treated. So, we can use that as a model to say, well, if that's what's happened in cows over the last 30 years, if we're not careful over the next 50, 60 years in humans, we're going to be in a parallel situation where, we're trying to do things more intensively, but actually creating more ill health as a result. And that's not, cows weren't ever designed to produce that much milk in nature.
One of the things that worries me a lot about this, and I hope he gets to the bottom of it, but Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in America, who's taken over as the head of the National Institute for Health, has had a bugbear for many years about a potential link between vaccines and autism.
Yeah.
But he also has acknowledged it could be geoengineering that's caused it, or EMF signals from 5G towers, or other pollutants in the water supply, or, and I think he's doing an investigation. The results are going to be published in September this year, because in 50, 60 years, we've gone from an average of 1 in 10,000 adults ending up with autism to 1 in about 30, and it's about 1 in 20 in boys. So the average is 1 in 30. So, and so I'm not saying what's caused that, but everyone acknowledges it's happened, and he's going to get to the bottom of what he thinks the cause has been.
Yeah.
I worry that all of this playing with nature, whether it's bovine cattle food or mRNA injections into pigs or whatever, or the food that they're given to eat, which is wrong for their biomes, and the fact that they may be twice as productive in terms of litres per cow per year, but if the cow lives half the number of years that it was living before, I just worry that there is going to be a whole series of knock-on consequences in human health.
Yeah.
over the next 10 to 20 years that reductionist ideology just won't have ever thought through?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely spot on. I think, so many different things like the autism, I think, is multifactorial. So I think, there's been talk of the childhood vaccinations. There's been talk of the EMFs, as you pointed out. I think, is it Stephanie Seneff has already, she thinks it's highly linked to glyphosate. So every, and again, these people working in their individual little fields have got their idea that it's what they're working on has caused it, and actually, it's more likely to be a combination of all these different things together into varying different degrees in different individuals. So, for some, vaccines might be more important. For some others, the EMFs might be important. For others, the glyphosate might be more important. But actually, altogether, they still have some sort of, if you like, synergistic adverse effect as opposed to synergistic good effect.
But they're all playing with nature.
They're all playing with nature. And as you say, we've seen with the Pottinger's cats how it can affect generations down the line as well. So, we've got a short window really to get things right, in order to hope that in 3 generations' time, we get back, or 4 generations, we get back to as healthier a population in general as possible. And I think that is what we're facing realistically, and not many people are actually thinking about that generational influence. But it is absolutely there. It's been more than proven, 100 years ago. So I think, we've got to start doing now for some immediate health benefits, but actually it's far more important that we look at the preventative health benefits of not messing with nature, because of the future generations.
Another example, as you were chatting of this reductionist challenge, is I've forgotten the word. It sounds like nicotine.
Neonicotinoids.
Yes, that I think were introduced to get rid of fleas and ticks.
Yes.
But then they have a highly toxic impact on bees and other pollinators. So there's a side effect.
Yeah.
No one took into consideration when they thought about, let's get rid of fleas and ticks.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's literally, one dog dose will kill literally billions of bees. They are that susceptible to it. And if we don't have pollinators, then our crops won't pollinate. So we hugely important, and it gets into the waterways and the food. The water filtering systems aren't getting rid of all these chemicals. We've spoken about glyphosate getting in the water, and neonicotinoids going in the water as well. But also the big one is estrogens from the pill and HRT. And I know they looked at some water downstream from a water treatment plant near Reading, and they put some male fish in a net and came back a while later, a couple of weeks later, and the male fish had all become feminized and changed to female fish. So, that's then going into our water that we're drinking as well. So, we are messing with in ways that we have no idea. And although water looks great, a lot of it, the chlorine in it isn't actually to kill the bacteria, it's to actually bleach it so it doesn't look quite so dirty. So we've got to get back to the basics of, we've got water system, but it's got to be properly filtered, and we don't want all these pharmaceuticals and chemicals, agrochem stuff going into the water, because it does affect us, and it will affect our animals, and therefore it will affect our food. So we keep coming back to it. We've got to get back to a much simpler approach. And it doesn't necessarily mean that simpler is a backward step. We can still use tractors. We can still have combine harvesters. We can still have whatever we want. We can still use those pieces of kit which have pushed things forward, but we just don't need to use all the chemicals. And we need to make sure that what we're producing food-wise is as healthy for our animals as it is for us.
I've got a couple of questions to wrap up with. And the first one's got a sort of part A and a part B. Um, can you explain to us how in the veterinary world, regulation works, like the MHRA works in the medical world for humans?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a government
Are there
body called,
conflicts of interest? Is there agency capture? How do they get funded? Who funds the research? All those kind of questions.
yeah. So there's an equivalence body for the veterinary medicines in the UK, which is called the Veterinary Medicines Directive. And so any medication, any pharmaceutical medication that is going to be used in animals, whether it's for food animals or pets or whatever, has got to be licensed. And so the
Is
veterinary
that
medicines,
like the FDA in America?
yes, is exactly. And you know, so they will get something like 80% of their funding will come from the fees that they charge for fulfilling those regulatory roles. However, the fact that so much
So
money,
they get 80% of their revenues from the people that they're trying to regulate and protect us from.
yes, yes. I mean, some of it, obviously, a load of it is from fees they're charging to sort of do that process. So, but it still
Yeah, but they don't
means
get paid if they don't approve it.
to a certain degree, yeah. And the same, you get the same pressure on research as well. Where if someone's doing a research project for a pharmaceutical company as a sort of preliminary stage for looking at I don't know, some sort of potential pharmaceutical, if if the results come back positive, they'll get to do the research for stage two. And if that comes back positive, they'll get the research. There's a good chance they'll get the research job for doing stage three. So there is a pressure externally because of how science is funded to produce the results that your customer or your clients is going to be beneficial for them. And to the point where there was the editor of The Lancet, Dr. Richard Horton, once said, up to 50% of everything that's published in veterinary journals can no longer be considered to be true. Much of it is falsified and is unrepeatable. So we're now in a situation where we've got a lot of published papers going out there which can't be repeated. There's no way to prove that those results are true. And people often will attack me because I use what I use in my work and say, oh, what you're doing, it's not published. If it was any good, it'd be published. And my replies to that, well, something like 60% of everything that's ever published as being definitely true is later found to be definitely not true. So the fact that I haven't got anything published in an article means I'm more likely to be right. but it's but joking apart, that is the situation. We're now at a place where a lot of the published research is bought. The journals themselves, obviously, they rely on advertising for a lot of their publication costs, and that advertising is paid for by the pharmaceutical industry. So they can turn around, or the pet food industry, the nutrition industry, which whether it's animals or people, and so there are pressures from outside that are dictating which papers are published and not published according to the agenda. And so it's a very serious situation where we actually can't rely on what is published, and we can't get good stuff that should be being published. It's not being published because it's not being accepted and it's being rejected. And we've seen that a lot over the last few years with various papers as well. I mean, some of them they're sort of starting to come out a bit more, pointing out the adverse reactions that have happened as a result of the COVID jabs. But initially, anybody try to publish one of those papers or suggest that the spike protein may not be a good idea to have been replicating it in the body, they're more likely to have been called in front of their principal at a university or a company or wherever and being sacked than for their paper to be published. So we've got to change how research is done. I think what we need is like a tier between those who are wanting the research done and those who deliver the laboratories that deliver the research, so that there's so the money is given to this middle level, and they get told what they want what they want to be tested, and then that middle level will then choose a laboratory or a group to do the research, and there's no direct route between the customer and the laboratory, so no pressure can be brought, and there's no pressure to produce anything other than the truth, because they're not reliant on direct funding for the next stage, because that will still have to go through this middle layer the whole time. So you actually free the scientists from external pressure, allow them to do proper research and properly construct the research as well. Instead of constructing it to find the answer they want to find, they can do a proper research product, which is actually objectively testing the product to see whether it's safe or not. And that way we'll end up with a much safer system overall, and much less interference, and a much more honest system.
In the last 50, 60 years, I'm sure I read this recently, we've gone from almost 0% of vets in the UK working for a company, and they're nearly all being self-employed, solopreneurs. And if I'm correct, I think something like 75% of vets now work for a company that's ultimately owned by the food companies, who also own the pet insurance companies.
Oh, it's the corporate system has unfortunately its biggest mistake the veterinary profession ever made. And so a lot of
the food that pets and farm animals are given is owned by the same group of people who own the veterinary practices, who of course are going to recommend the food. And do they also own is there veterinary pharma companies, or is it all the usual suspects, the GlaxoSmithKlines and Pfizer?
Yeah.
Do they also do animal pharma products?
Yeah, I think you've got basically the big sort of pet food brand owners are Mars, Palmolive, Colgate, and Procter and Gamble, and between them they own the vast majority of commercial pet food. So even if someone changes a brand, they might still be paying the same corporate behind it. And then Mars have bought up they've got a group of practices, one of the corporate groups of practices, and they've also got, so that's been, it's an investment, and I'm sure all these corporations have got, pharma arms, so they will own different pharma brands in the same way that they own different food brands. So, and then they're all, interlinked and buddies with, the big SmithKline.
Yeah, but they also own
and all the rest of
the
it.
pet insurance companies as well.
And then, well, I mean, the pet insurance companies you would thought would be try and keep an element of separation, because, they make their profits from having healthy animals, right? that they collect the
No, but Roger, that's actually
treating, but it doesn't.
That's actually a misnomer. That in pet insurance companies actually make more money out of unhealthy pets.
Sure.
There's a couple of papers that prove that. Right. So we've got a lot we've been through today. On that last point, though, all the things that we talked about before sound like they're being catalyzed and amplified almost by a corrupt system that is making the whole matter worse. And but it also needs to be thought, zoom out again and think about regenerative farming and how that impacts on the health of people and would reduce other costs in the matrix. So if there was one initiative, by the way, I asked this question to all of our guests, if there was one initiative that we, the Truth Contract, could get 10 million people in the UK to vote for in a TTC referendum, what would you choose the issue to be that we got that many votes for?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is hubris and arrogance within that the corruption as well. But the basic, I think, the main thing that I think people would need to vote on and make a decision about is, stop messing with nature in any way that hasn't been properly and independently safety tested, and which has also been proven to be safe and beneficial and economically viable. So it's got to be, satisfy the bigger picture criteria, if you like, rather than just that individual reductionist thing that they think they might be solving. We've got to think on a much wider scale, and the biggest area is, let's just not mess with stuff that we really don't fully understand, because in the past it's always come back to bite us. And unfortunately, as I've said, I don't trust that if we carry on doing it, it's not going to keep biting us in a bigger and bigger way. The more time we have to learn the lesson, the more difficult it becomes each time.
Thank you. Why, just a supplement, why do you think we haven't learned any lessons from this? What you're saying is, if we keep letting this carry on the way it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And there's lots of reference points that we can point to where that reductionist thinking a year, 2 years later was exposed for the fraudulent intellectual point of view that it had. Why is it we don't seem to learn those lessons? Is it just the commercial interests of the equivalent of big pharma in veterinary?
I think there is certainly the commercial pressure is huge. I think there's also the arrogance to think, well, that we are making much faster progress and that we're better than our forefathers were before at doing stuff, and therefore we'll get it right this time. I think it is that arrogance and hubris to think that, well, I've learned more at university, or I've learned more over the last 30 years than anybody knew before. So I've got it right this time. And I think there's it is that a lot of the time, I think, and as you say, the financial pressure behind, and those pressures have got bigger and bigger. The always finds it, obviously your background in finance, I always find it strange that it's not okay if you made $1 billion profit last year to still make $1 billion profit this year. It's somehow got to grow and it's got to be bigger. And you go, why? Well, surely is $1 billion profit not enough? But it is that we've always got to keep on expanding what we do. We've got to try and make it, build and make it bigger and make it better, and yet time after time we fail in doing so and never seem to learn. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more. I think there's an additional dimension, which is, to go back to use your word, hubris, where somehow people think that they have already learned how to outsmart Mother Nature.
absolutely. Yeah, no, we know so little. When I first qualified and I'd done my, perhaps, maybe 2 or 3 years in, I'd got past my exams. I'd been in practice for a couple of years. I'd sort of been at the coalface, and I was pretty competent at what I did now, and I've done some CPD and kept up to date, and I thought I knew, I don't know, 80% of what I needed, to know from my job. And then, 30 years on, I know probably 10,000, 100,000 times more information and now recognize that rather than knowing 80% of what there is to know, I think I'll be lucky if I know 0.1%. And yet, I know 10,000 times as much, and actually a lot of it in a completely different direction. So, it is we seem to have lost humility, I think, and to recognize that there is so much more to know, that we have no inkling of yet at all. I mean, I think so much, and much of what we think we know very well, I think a lot of that will probably at some point be proven to be totally wrong as well. So, we've just it's the arrogance that goes with that hubris. Yeah.
Yeah, so we ought to ask the question, well, what would Mother Nature do if left alone
Yeah.
versus what can we do to tinker and play with Mother Nature to change it as we, the masters of the universe, now want?
Well, precisely. I think that's that is always the basis of if we let nature take its course to a certain degree. I mean, as I said, I don't heal anything as a practitioner. All I can do is point my patients in the right direction and let their body do it themselves. And I can give them a guiding push and speed it along, but I can't do it. And I think we've got to recognize that that's actually all we can do in so many other things as well.
Roger, thank you very much. We'll put a link to your professional and personal website in the notes below. And as I said at the top of the interview, as a recent patient with my bad back, I can certainly testify to a 1-hour treatment having a miraculous impact after 48 hours. So thank you so much for your time today. I've loved this conversation about let's stop messing with Mother Nature. We do it in so many ways that we just haven't thought about the knock-on consequences. You've answered so many questions that I think everyone will find fascinating. So thank you for your time and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Lovely. Thanks, David. Appreciate it. It's been fun. Absolutely.
Take care. Thank you.